The story of the Manson family has been told and retold. We know the names that have haunted history: Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, Tex Watson. We've heard about the brutal murders and the madness that gripped the summer of 1969. But this series isn't just about those infamous figures. This is also about the ones you may never have heard of, the forgotten faces, including the final girls who joined just as the family was collapsing. These next young women were the last to join Manson's circle before the arrests in Death Valley. They weren't there when the bloodshed unfolded in Los Angeles, but their brief time with the family would forever alter their lives. Their names are almost lost to history. The last girls of the Manson family were teenagers, searching for freedom, community, or just a place to belong. They had no idea they had just stepped into the heart of darkness. In early 1969, Charles Manson's commune seemed like a refuge for those drifting through the counterculture or the misadventures of their own lives. Runaways, hitchhikers, and lost souls were warmly welcomed at Spahn Ranch, where Manson played the role of a messianic figure, a friend, and even a father, offering love, peace, and a little bit of revolution. But by July, the mask of free love had already begun to slip away. These 4 young women weren't involved in the Tate-LaBianca murders. In fact, they barely had time to settle into the madness before the family's downfall began. In October 1969, just a few months after the gruesome killings that shocked the world, Manson and his followers were hiding out in Death Valley. They believed they were waiting out the coming apocalypse, but the police were closing in. That October, Manson and many of his followers were arrested at Barker and Myers ranches in Death Valley, ending their delusional escape. Susan Bartell, Colleen Sinclair, Diane VonAhn, and Claudia Smith were caught up in the arrests, swept into the legal chaos that followed. They weren't there for the murders, but their lives were now forever linked to one of the most notorious cults in American history. Their association with the family, though brief, came at a heavy price: public scrutiny, guilt by association, and the weight of a dark legacy followed them for the rest of their lives. They escaped the violent crimes of that fateful summer, but they couldn't escape the shadow of the Manson name. Even decades later, the question remains: what became of them after their time with the family? Did they find peace, or were they forever haunted for the days spent in Charlie's dark orbit? The first mention of Sue Bartell comes from a statement later made by Spahn Ranch employee Ruby Pearl Molinaro after the family was implicated in the murder of ranch hand Donald "Shorty" Shea. Molinaro told police that in July 1969, after Shorty got married to a black barmaid and stripper in Vegas, he brought his new bride to the ranch to show her off. Charles Manson, deeply racist, was shocked that Shea had the audacity to bring Magdalene Velma Stokes around these parts, and other members of the family were also rude to the couple. Ruby explained that he brought her to the ranch, and it made the hippies mad. Gypsy and Sue told everyone in the Manson family not to sit in the same chair that Shorty's wife had sat in after she left. Susan Bartell, a.k.a. Country Sue, was an 18-year-old from the Valley. With long, dark brown hair, blue eyes, she was a graduate of nearby Canoga High School. There are no stories reported about how she first encountered the family, but a lot of nearby teens used to come ride the ponies at Spahn's, or hang out at the Munch Box, a local fast food joint, or just hitchhiking around the region. It is possible that she wasn't living at the ranch, since her folks would have been just a few miles away. Our next reference to Country Sue is connected to the evidence presented during the Tate-LaBianca trial against Manson and his 3 female co-defendants. After the August murders, the 9th and 10th, the auto theft raid, the 16th, A subsequent arrest of Manson at the ranch around August 21st, allegedly for marijuana possession, although the cigarette in question turned out to be hand-rolled tobacco, and the murder of Shay, because he was believed to be a snitch. Charlie decided to get the family away from Spahn Ranch. In early September, most of the family journeyed to Death Valley. However, a few people remained behind in Chatsworth, including Catherine Cappy Gillies and Sue Bartell. P.S. We don't know how she got the name Country Sue. Sue had enlisted a high school friend to join her at Spahn's. Colleen Sinclair, nicknamed Collie, was a 16-year-old originally from San Francisco. While hanging out at the ranch one day, Collie and Country Sue decided to doodle on a cupboard door. We believe that this would have occurred in early October, since one of the citations is a quote from a Beatles song that was released on September 26th. In Sue's own words, about her time at Spahn's that fall and the doodles on the door, I didn't go, but everybody else did, which meant that there was nobody left to take care of George, take care of the horses, take care of the ranch that Charlie loved, and he left 3 of us girls behind. That would have been Cappy and me and another friend of mine from the valley, Colleen Sinclair. Her and I were the authors of the infamous cupboard door that said Helter Skelter on it. We were writing down the words to a song we liked. Period. Nothing scary. Those words, Helter Skelter, written on that door and found during the prosecution's investigation ahead of the 1970 trial, helped connect Manson and the family to the words written in a victim's blood at one crime scene. Meanwhile, before the Spahn Ranch trio joined them in Death Valley, the family committed a spectacularly stupid act of arson, the torching of a large earth mover that they believed was preventing their dune buggy rides across the national park. Law enforcement tracked them and their vehicles and discovered Barker and Myers ranches, where half of the family were then sequestered. That group got arrested on October 10th, the first day of a multi-part law enforcement investigation. The rest got nabbed 2 days later when they went to the desert to try to get the others out of jail. The second group included Manson, Gillies, and Bartell. All of the men arrested on the 12th had been in Los Angeles or Vegas on the days prior. Squeaky, Lynette Frome, and Sue Bartell were the last to arrive at Barker Ranch from Spahn, just in time to get thrown in the clink. Therefore, the writing on the door would have occurred before Sinclair left for the desert, as little as a day or two before Bartell and Lynn Frome drove out. The arresting officers picked up the family on charges of the arson and suspicion of stolen vehicles. The local crew didn't know that the arrested were also the perpetrators of a 9-person murder spree back in L.A., but someone filled in the dots. While in jail in Independence, Susan Atkins got questioned by homicide investigators about the murder of musician Gary Hinman, a former family friend. She was then transferred to Los Angeles. Most of the family were released days later, except for those implicated directly in the torching of the earth mover. In late October or very early November, Country Sue and another family member, Little Patty, were panhandling in Venice. They met a young Marine Corps veteran, Mark Ross. He didn't have any money to give them, but offered them a place to stay at his rented apartment near the beach. Little Patty and Country Sue invited a few of their friends. On November 5th, police were summoned to Ross's apartment after someone called in a shooting. Officers found a young man deceased in a bedroom. The young man, John Philip Haught, known as Zero or Christopher Jesus, had been in bed with Little Patty when he allegedly played a losing game of Russian roulette. The other occupants of the house included Country Sue, Cappy, Bruce Davis, and Bill Van Sickle. The police found that the gun in question had been wiped clean, but traces of Davis's prints were later found on it. Investigators quickly decided that Zero's death was an accident, even though apparently every chamber in the weapon had held a bullet, and they closed the case. A few days later, Sue visited Sadie at Sybil Brand, the women's jail in Los Angeles, and told her about Zero's death. Country Sue laughed when she relayed that apparently when Zero died, he had a sexual climax. Sue remained with the family into 1970 and 1971, including living at Spawn Ranch and being filmed by documentarian Robert Hendrickson for his film about Manson, released in 1973. It is rumored that during the trials, Bartell placed threatening calls to members of the prosecutor's office, and she was later arrested for abetting the escape of Kenneth Como. She served no time for those charges. Sue was close with Squeaky, Sandy, Nancy Pittman, and with Maria Crystal Alonzo. In November 1971, Crystal and Sue were arrested at a Sunset Boulevard motel after soliciting two vice officers for paid sex. That's the last official dated reference to Sue's involvement with the family, although it is believed that she remained close to the former members. Today, Country Sue lives in Central California. She has at least one adult child, a daughter, and I hear she's a big fan of reggae music. Colleen Ann Sinclair, a.k.a. Collie, was born July 11, 1953. She was just 16 years old in 1969, a student at nearby Canoga High, where she was friends with Sue Bartell, a.k.a. Country Sue. Collie was born in San Francisco and had lived in Las Vegas and Tarzana before enrolling at Canoga High. In the autumn of 1969, while most of the family were in Death Valley following the murders, Collie was hanging out at Spawn Ranch with Sue. We do not know if she was staying at the ranch or just visiting her friend for the afternoon, but apparently the two were bored and decided to doodle on a cupboard door. Again, as Sue later explained, Colleen Sinclair, her and I were the authors of the infamous cupboard door that said Helter Skelter on it. We were writing down the words to a song we liked. Collie wound up at Barker Ranch before Sue did, by how long? Days, perhaps? And was arrested with the family on the 10th of October, resulting in a mugshot. She gave the name Beth Tracy at her arrest. However, that's the last of Collie. Yep, short and sweet. A couple days in Death Valley and a visit to the local jail was enough to apparently disconnect her interest in all things Manson. We presume that she returned to her family, finished her schooling, and went on to live a good life. There is one photo of her from about 20 years ago that we found online. I'd dig further, but frankly speaking, she didn't commit any crimes. She isn't suspected of doing something nefarious. She just hung out with a friend and then took a little trip to Death Valley and hightailed it back to civilization days later. She may be living in Orange County these days, though I'm not sure. She doesn't really warrant an investigation. Hope you're doing well, Collie, and that you have lots of love. The next two young women who joined the family, the final two in fact, both had connections to one of the most mysterious figures in the whole group, an ex-convict nicknamed Cowboy Bill. Bill had served time in a number of federal prisons and was a lifelong thief. But he was known by the public for the past 50-plus years by some of his aliases: Bill Vance, William Rex Cole, Dwayne Schwarm, David Lee Hammock, Billy Van Sickey, until research finally revealed his true name of William Joseph Law Van Sickle, born in April 1933 in Missouri. I'll be covering Bill at great length in a dedicated video later on, but I do want to touch upon him here because he is connected to the next two of the last girls. In early 1969, Van Sickle, who apparently had met Charlie some years earlier while both were serving time, we aren't exactly sure where, showed up at Spawn Ranch looking for the owner, George. At the time, the family were not all living at the ranch, but Squeaky Frome was there, and she didn't care much for the looks of old Cowboy Bill, who showed up with his battered boxer's face and handsy behaviors. Bill had a connection to the ranch, with a previous driver's license listing it as his residence. Might have been a ranch hand for a season, perhaps. Bill didn't stay at Spawn's after encountering Squeaky, but up the road a bit in Canoga Park, near a house that Charlie later rented as the group began to grow again that season. Bill spent the summer of 1969, once the family fully relocated over, robbing and stealing all over the valley. But apparently murder crossed the line for him. Kinda. You see, in late July 1969, 3 members of the family killed Gary Hinman, a musician in Topanga Canyon. Bill was involved with family member Ella Jo Bailey, and Ella Jo may have, wittingly or unwittingly, put Hinman in the crosshairs of the killers by suggesting he might have recently come into an inheritance. Neither Ella Jo or Bill were at Gary's home the weekend he was tortured and killed, but Ella did help clean up fingerprints from a vehicle stolen from the victim back at the ranch. She told Bill, and they decided to take off. They went to Ohio, and then on their trip from there south to Florida, Ella got arrested for writing bad checks. Bill left her there, and we're uncertain why, but he then came back to California, spent a couple days at Spawn Ranch, and then went up to Oregon, and when he returned in late August, he brought Diane VonAhn with him. Diane, or Diana Marie as she was named, was born on November 16, 1949, in Truckee, California. Her mother was 20-year-old Patricia Louise Crandall. Patricia was born in September 1929 in Los Angeles County. Her parents, Fred Crandall and Leona Kepke Crandall, were both from the Midwest. Fred from North Dakota, Leona from Missouri. Patricia also had a younger sister, Virginia, born in 1931, also in Los Angeles County. The family relocated north to the Shasta, California area, where Patricia attended high school in nearby Redding. Patricia was 5 foot 3 inches and 112 pounds as a young woman. But then in March 1949, when she was 19 years old, Patricia was reported missing to authorities, presumably by her folks. At the time she went missing, she was wearing a green hooded cape coat and carrying a black suitcase. 4 months later, that July, Patricia married a man named Eugene Gene Klein, approximately 200 miles away in Reno, Nevada. However, her missing file never got updated. Diane was born just a few months after Patricia and Gene married, and about 6 months after her mother left home. So it sounds like her mother got pregnant, and she quarreled with her family and took off. Things remained turbulent. In April 1951, Patricia and Gene were divorced in Redding. Sometime in 1951, Patricia's home was broken into by a potential attacker. He left without harming her, just taking some money, but it was clear that his intent initially was sexual assault. After divorcing Gene, Patricia remarried a man named Horn. That marriage did not last long either, and then in 1955, Patricia married Curtis Marcus VonAhn in Skamania, Washington. VonAhn was a firefighter for the Oregon Forestry Service, and after their wedding, the family lived in the Hood River area. Thankfully for Patricia and Diane, this was a good union. Patricia and Curtis had 3 more children together over the next few years, and little Diane had younger siblings. Curtis was a U.S. Army veteran of the conflict in Korea and spent his entire professional life working for the Forestry Service. But in February 1962, at the age of 33, Patricia was killed in an auto accident in Cascade Locks, there in the Hood River area. Her eldest daughter was just 12 years old. Patricia was killed in a collision with a man in another vehicle. He lived, and she died. The VonAhn family then relocated to Gresham, Oregon, near Portland. From 1966 to 67, Diane attended Gresham High, and then in 1968, she was registered at Washington High in Portland. Curtis remarried a woman named Geraldine in March 1969 when Diane was 19. Diane, possibly unhappy that her stepdad was moving on after her mother's death 7 years before, then meets Cowboy Bill a few months later. We believe Bill was visiting family in the Portland area in mid to late August 1969. Bill not only brought young Diane with him back to California and Spahn Ranch, but he also stole a driver's license and blank checks from a man named Dwayne Schwarm, who was also a resident of Gresham, Oregon. It's not a far cry to imagine that Dwayne was perhaps a neighbor or family friend of Diane's. And Bill had a habit of picking up girls and useful forms of ID and currency to suit his whims. Bill was definitely back at Spahn Ranch by August 26th, when he either witnessed or participated in the murder of Donald Shorty Shea, the ranch hand. We don't know if Diane was there with him then, or perhaps a day or two later. Bill was never legally charged with Shea's murder. Bill was also hanging around with Vern Plumley, an AWOL Marine, and two other young vets, Kenneth Brown and John Haught, during August, and the four were on a crime spree that involved theft, breaking and entering, and even assaulting an actor who lived not far from where Sharon Tate and her friends were killed just a couple weeks before. Again, not to go into too much detail here about Bill, but both Diane and the next young woman we're going to cover have profound connections to the cowboy con man. So Diane comes to Spahn Ranch and then takes off with the family for Death Valley after the murder of Shea. Diane is then arrested in Death Valley in October with the others, giving the name Mary Ann Schwarm. Yeah, Schwarm. And she stays there in Independence with Sandy and Squeaky after their release from the local jail. Bill, you'll remember, is in Venice Beach in early November, so the two of them are no longer together. In fact, by this time, Diane is involved with Vern Plumley. So what became of Diane? Well, Diane and Vern Plumley take off just before the time of the grand jury, December 1969, and head up to Spanaway, Washington, to a commune there. Spanaway is a farming community near McCord Air Force Base, near Tacoma. Months later in 1970, Plumley and another man are arrested in Spanaway. That September, Vern and Robert Eugene Russell met some people drinking at a bar down in Long Beach, California, went to their house, started stealing stuff, and got caught, and a fight commenced. Plumley and Russell stabbed two of the men and then fled to Washington. They were arrested for assault, attempted murder, theft, and the Dyer Act, taking a stolen car over state lines. Vern served 7 years for his role in the attempted murders. Diane was still up in Spanaway, possibly staying at the commune. In June 1972, she and a man named George W. Bailey, aka Skip, were down in the Portland area racing on a motorcycle. Skip, 25, was a married mechanic with a young daughter and son. Skip lost control of the bike and crashed into another car. Diane was killed in the accident. Bailey survived the crash, but died a few days later of his injuries. Diana Marie VonAhn was dead at 22 years of age. We do not know when Claudia Lee Smith met the family, but she was there for the last hurrah, the arrests in Death Valley. Claudia, born August 11, 1950, was an only child from what I can tell. Her dad was from Colorado, her mom from North Dakota. A couple years ago, I found an old newspaper clipping indicating that she had been rescued as a young child from a house fire, but I've since been unable to locate that article. We know really nothing much about who she was, what she was interested in, or little about her at the time of the arrests. It is possible that she is the blonde woman pictured here, but even that, I'm not quite sure. Nor do we know where she went immediately after the arrest in the desert. So why mention her at all? Because of what happened later. In 1970, Claudia Lee Smith, Bill Van Sickle, and Patricia Baldwin, Little Patty, traveled to Kansas City, Missouri. That October, at Trinity Hospital in KC, Claudia gave birth to a baby girl. Bill applied for a license from a Florida-based ministry and named his new program Youth for Life. Using his new ministry, Bill then leased 2 adjoining farms, 200 acres, in McFall, Missouri, just over an hour north of Kansas City. The four, little Patty, Claudia and her infant daughter, and Wild Bill, then moved to the property and began preparing to sow it with the intention of growing organic vegetables. From statements that Claudia later made to a local journalist, Nubian Farms, as the property was called, would grow a variety of vegetables using manure and other natural materials, but no DDT or chemical pesticides. Over the next year, they had a modicum of success with their first harvest and began selling produce to regional markets. They attracted other young people to their mission and welcomed them in makeshift housing. Sometimes they had a couple of folks helping out. One time a group of 35 arrived. Each person would work pretty much all day out in the fields. There wasn't much in the way of sanitation and plumbing, however, and locals remembered the group as being a bit like Pigpen in the Peanuts comics. In fact, with only a water pump and an outhouse, several members of the Nubian Farms commune got very sick with dysentery that season. In July 1971, a local reporter came out to interview the residents at Nubian Farms after hearing stories about a group of hippies managing to work the land. Neil Sheehan, a reporter for the Stanberry Headlight, showed up in McFall, where he encountered 3 young people at the property. He interviewed a young woman who called herself Linda and claimed to be 22 years old. She was actually 20-year-old Claudia Lee Smith. She was friendly, as was the young man, gave the name of John Weaver, said he was a student at Moore Park Junior College in Ventura, California, taking off a semester to help at the farm. The third person, a petite brunette, was not so friendly. She was none other than little Patty, who bummed a hand-rolled cigarette from the reporter, but also warned the other two that if he got too nosy, to throw him off the property. When Sheehan asked Claudia about their ministry, she explained that Youth for Life promoted a philosophy of total acceptance of all churches and beliefs with no prejudice at all. After leaving Nubian Farms, Sheehan, as he began writing his article, learned that the land was being leased by one Reverend William R. Cole, a.k.a. Bill Van Sickle. Sheehan wrote a follow-up to his first piece, again lauding the hard work and innovation of the hippie farmers. But after his second article came out, there was a scurry of activity around Nubian Farms. First, little Patty had some kind of emotional breakdown that August and burned down a house on the property before leaving. Then, in Kansas City, author Ed Saunders was approached at a poetry reading by a young couple who told him that Cowboy Bill of the Manson family was living an hour away. Saunders immediately called LAPD and the homicide detectives who had investigated the murder of Gary Hinman. At the time, Bruce Davis of the Manson family was being tried for his role in Hinman's murder and the slaying of Spawn Ranch hand Donald Shorty Shea. Saunders knew that the Hinman investigators had been looking for Bill for over a year. They had been told about an audio recording made after Hinman's July 1969 murder by multiple members of the family, a kind of theatrical and musical reenactment of Gary's day-and-a-half torture and death. Rumor had it that Bill had absconded with the recording, which might also include information about other potential crimes and murders committed by the family. So, as soon as Whiteley and Gunther, the investigators, learned about Bill's whereabouts, they made arrangements to get to Nubian Falls. They arrived in March 1972, but too late. In late February, Bill, Claudia, the baby girl, and everyone else took off. Clearly, someone must have tipped them off about LAPD's impending arrival. They went first to Kansas City to stay for a couple days and told their host they were taking a bus to Texas from there. At the time, Claudia was actually wanted back in California on check forgery charges, and of course, Bill was wanted on a variety of matters, including theft, forgery, and possibly holding a key piece of evidence with the alleged audio recording. Upon learning that little Patty was gone, Whiteley and Gunther were alarmed. Remember, both Bill and Patty were present for the unaliving of John Zero Hott, a.k.a. Christopher Jesus, in Venice Beach. Patty was apparently in bed with Zero at the time that he spun a loaded revolver and shot himself, Russian roulette style. Police had been called, and quickly surmised that this was an accidental. But there were still suspicious activities, including fingerprints being wiped off the gun before law enforcement arrived. Was Bill keeping an eye on little Patty so that she didn't tell anyone what really happened to Zero? The investigators were worried that little Patty might have met with foul play. A letter left at the scene by an unnamed author only intensified those concerns. Written on August 27, 1971, it read, "I got your letter yesterday. That's really something, Patty leaving. I sure as hell hope she keeps her mouth shut. Don't take any chance with Patty. I don't know the whole story, but from what you wrote in the letter, it doesn't sound too safe. You take it easy. Be careful. I don't know what Patty's trip is. Don't take the chance. She could you up." But according to others, when Patty had her meltdown, Bill phoned her parents in West Pennsylvania, who arrived and took her to Memphis and a health facility there. And I can verify that Baldwin is still alive. Whiteley and Gunther's trip to McFall was a bust. No audio of the Hinman reenactment was left behind at the scene. During their time there, the Hinman investigators did piece together some information on Claudia Lee Smith. On September 20, 1969, she was arrested in Los Angeles County on a narcotics charge. She listed her occupation as babysitting in Topanga Canyon and was released on bond. We don't know if Bill and Claudia actually went to Texas, but we do know they wound up quickly in California, which is weird since they were both wanted there on different charges. Claudia later sent a letter to the owners of the McFall property, apologizing for leaving in haste and not for making personal amends, but leaving all items at the farm to the owner's discretion. In March 1972, Neil Sheehan followed up his original article with a new piece in the Stanberry Headlight, summing up the wild experience of discovering that members of the bloodthirsty Manson family had been living all the way out in western Missouri for the past 2 years. He then received his own letter from Claudia, reading, "Bill and I have read the articles in the Stanberry Headlight, and for the most part found them very nice. We realize the news media sees anyone ever connected with Charles Manson as a murderer. That was not our trip. Our trip is our religion. Our religion is one of all religions. Our goal is to bring people together in harmony and love. Everybody can join together under the 3 necessities of life: food, shelter, and clothing. Regardless of anyone's opinions for his wants and needs, we can identify with these 3 necessities. We knew we would be discovered, and also knew of the emphasis and value that would be placed on the music tape in our possession. We now feel the time has come when the music should be published. This music should not be regarded as entertainment. We extend an invitation to all media of publication interested in the music should write to C. Smith, P.O. Box 3077, Simi, California, 93065. Bill and I would like to express our deepest thanks to Claire and Kathy Clevenger, Tank Popplewell and family, George Gist, Clifford Pierce, Floyd and George Parks, Floyd Reed and Mother, Jean Lupier, the Stanberry Headlight, and everyone who liked us. Thanks for just being our friends. Respectfully, Linda and Bill." The Stanberry Headlight then published a 4th and final piece by Sheehan on the Manson, Missouri connection, sharing Claudia's letter. So what became of Claudia Lee Smith after she, her baby, and Bill left Missouri? First of all, when I originally uploaded the video 3 years ago with Bill's real name and background info, I'll recap some of that when I do a more focused video on Van Sickle. I mentioned that the baby girl born to Claudia in late 1970 may or may not have been Bill's daughter. I now believe that she is his daughter. For one thing, I've seen her high school picture, and she bears more of a similarity to Bill than to Claudia. Second, because Claudia and Bill had another child together. In June 1972, in Ventura, California, Claudia gave birth to a baby, a son, with Bill. Less than a month later, Claudia's father died in Ventura at the age of 56. 19 days later, Claudia and Bill were married there in Oxnard. But by 1978, Bill and Claudia were not together. She was involved with another man, and after she and Bill divorced, she married her second husband and had 3 more children with him, all boys. Many years later, she married a third time, not sure if she was divorced or widowed from her second husband, and her third husband passed away in 2013. At various times, the family lived in Southern California and in Missouri. Just recently, I received the following comment on my original video about Cowboy Bill. Bill lived in the town that I live in about 25 to 30 years ago when he was released from prison. Claudia Smith still lived here about 10 years ago. Spoke to her on several occasions. Looks like her house is empty now, and property records show that it's been sold. And by the way, that infamous audio has never been shared. So that tells you a little bit about Claudia Lee Smith, the final of the last girls of the Manson family. Diane VonAhn was dead of a motorcycle crash just a couple years later. Colleen disappeared into the ether. Claudia, like her first ex-husband, is a bit of a mystery. And Country Sue is doing her thing today. Their time with the family was brief but unforgettable. I'm sure the surviving women of this group are grateful that they managed to get out with their freedom, and probably a lot of stories to tell. Stay tuned for the next edition of What Became of the Manson Family, where we will explore the complicated tale of the Lost Boys. Until then.